Hi everyone, I'm Shreya. As Dr. Boyd said, I'm a senior in political science and communication with a minor in history, and my presentation was about the ad hominem logical fallacy attack and how they influence political campaigns and how they influence voters based on whatever side they are inclined towards. So, first we do what is an ad hom attack. So an ad hom attack is when instead of addressing someone's argument, position, or what they do, you address something about them, something that is more personal, something that could be related to a group they're part of, an interest that they have, anything really. The example I used last year of this was when Dr. Boyd always wears a bow tie, and so if I say that Com 204 is a strange class because of his bow tie, I am making an ad hom attack on him. I am not talking about his syllabus, I'm not talking about his class, and if you've never taken Com 204, you are likely to believe me. Ad hom attacks in politics are incredibly common because they are the easiest way to delegitimize your opponent. And they work incredibly effectively because, again, most people don't really know what the other candidate's political stance or standing could be. And they are a double-edged sword because sometimes you really can go too far, and you know, the videos I'm about to show are going to demonstrate how that happens. So I have two videos of President Donald Trump on the 2020 campaign rally. First is a rally in Florida, and I'm using the first couple of minutes of a speech that he was giving there.
The contrast between a 5-decade career politician, Sleepy Joe, right? How do you think he did in the debate last night? He was sharp as a tack, who was fighting only for himself in a business.
So these are some of the ad hom attacks he had in that little clip, 5-decade career politician, but the tone that he said it in clearly showed his despise for that because Trump's entire platform was that he is not a politician and that he is an outsider who could change Washington. He called him Sleepy Joe, again an ad hom attack, had nothing to do with Joe Biden's policies or what his platform was. Sharp as a tack. Tacks aren't sharp. This is a rally in New Hampshire. This is the one about Barack Obama. Here.
And you know what? They don't show Barack Hussein Obama. He came out to campaign 2 days ago. Right? And they had 42 people. He drew flies. Did you ever hear the expression? Obama drew flies, but they don't show that. But we want them to show our crowds.
So this is an example of how it can go a little bit too far. Barack Hussein Obama, there's an indication there that he is not a natural-born US citizen. It goes back to the conspiracy theory that he is of Muslim descent, and there is racist undertones there. He drew flies, Obama drew flies. This goes back to its crowd size. And again, if you weren't at that Obama rally, you aren't going to know how many people were there. So if Trump says 42 people showed up, for all you know, 42 people showed up. That's an ad hom attack. There's no way of verifying that, not unless you really go searching and look at pictures or try to find out how many people really did show up to this rally. And to say that a former president was drawing flies at a crowd rally, a two-term president, it really does show that it had no standing or of his policies or, again, his stances for Joe Biden. So this just shows how powerful they are, just because you can say it and people will believe you. There is no way to really verify that. There is no way to really even counter that. Because if someone draws a personal attack on you, you either draw a personal attack on them or you just try to start defending yourself. And both situations are lose-lose. So yeah, if the competitor is not there to respond, anything you say to anyone is going to be cemented as the truth from then on. So yeah, this really matters in the real world, especially because of how polarized our politics are now. I feel like a lot of people don't really understand how the stances and the policies matter more than whether or not they like a candidate. And them liking or not liking a candidate is based on whatever their favorite politician is saying about another person. And so it becomes really, really difficult to actually understand the politics in a situation rather than this person said this and that person said that and this was this person's response. That was my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
So keep that on. Who has a question for Shreya?
As a rhetorician, I really appreciate your presentation and your study. So my question is about your selection of your texts. I think that, and you alluded to this in the first clip, right? It's not so much what Trump says, but how Trump says it, the delivery, right? Because if I were to just look at the transcripts, he says sharp as a tack. Sarcastically, I mean, 5-year politician or 5-decade politician could be interpreted as a positive thing, but he certainly says it in a negative way. So how did you, I mean, if I were approaching a study like this, I would go to the transcripts, right, and not be able to find what you found. So how did you identify these texts?
Yeah, so I was actually following the rally videos. I was very interested in knowing what was going on during that time when he was running. And so when I had the chance to put those videos in my presentation, I sort of knew that I would be able to find videos of him talking sarcastically. And they were there in the C-SPAN archives, so I was just able to sort of look at that and clip it to fit into my presentation.
Of course, I'm going to ask a question that that you didn't study. We've been looking at different ways that women campaign or speak. Do you think women can do ad hominem attacks as well as men?
I think they can, absolutely. A lot of the ad hominem attacks of women come from a more patriarchal mindset. I think the previous presentation talked about motherhood, and attacking another woman's motherhood is one of the most common ad hominem attacks, at least that I've seen. I haven't done the research on that, but those are the ones that you find most commonly because it sort of attacks you as a woman. And so while you may not have Sleepy Joe, so you might not say Sleepy Clinton, they do say like hang, or I can't remember what the one for Hillary Clinton was. Donald Trump did come up with a name for that. But I think that they do ad hominem attacks pretty well, but they are more highlighted as ad hominem attacks because they are women. And so they say, because you're a woman, you're just saying this, you're being hysterical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Amazing job. I actually did, at least myself, I did similar research for like one of my term papers like a good couple semesters ago about the effectiveness of like smear political ad campaigns. Do you think like this type of like ad hominem rhetoric and things like that or do you think it would be a good like thing to dive into from your own personal experience diving into this the way you have to see its effect on possibly getting people like reelected or elected, of how like you referenced the like crooked Hillary like slogan and stuff like that, just to like get like one narrative going for a political opponent. It's been used basically by everyone in the political sphere. But do you think there's a serious debate or like interesting like route to go based on like how the verbiage is used and like if it's, because we were talking earlier yesterday about like things being planned and stuff like that, so it's whether the targeting of how the verbiage is used could be more like dived into of like when it's used, how it's used, the precision at which it's used and stuff like that.
So just to clarify your question, you're asking if ad hominem attacks can be more targeted and precise?
Yes.
Okay. So I think that, like you said, crooked Hillary, or we think of Sleepy Joe Biden, or even if you say hang Mike Pence, these terms sort of just come to your mind immediately if you think of these people and their relationship with Donald Trump. So I think that it is something that has become a lot more prevalent since 2016. And it is something that is now like sort of linked to their identity almost. And so to make it more precise, I think would be sort of a challenge going from here, because in my experience at least following this, almost everyone has an adjective in front of their name now. And so with the polarization and the situation that we're in, where half the country believes one thing and the other half the country believes the other thing, I think that targeting ad hom attacks would be quite a challenge, and I haven't seen it be so targeted so far. From what I've seen is just if anyone insults you or if anyone does something that you don't like, then you launch an ad hom attack on them.
All right, thank you.
Two parts, Shreya. Thank you very much for a great presentation. First part is, do you think the ad hominem attacks benefit the person who is making them? And then the second part is, do you think this contributes to the polarization in America?
Okay, so as far as if it benefits the person making them, I think it really depends on what kind of a supporter base you have. Because sometimes you have a supporter base that will think you can do no wrong. And so if you do an ad hom attack, they're like, oh yeah, this makes sense, this is actually correct. And they start using that terminology going forth. But I think that going back to Dr. Browning's question, if a woman were to make such an ad hom attack, it would not be the same as Donald Trump making an ad hom attack. She would be actually penalized for that. So it really does depend on what kind of supporter base you have and what your identity is and what kind of politics you are a part of. And if it contributes to polarization, I think it absolutely does. It paints liberals in a certain light, Democrats in a certain light, and Republicans in a certain light. And it just makes it so that you can't have a discussion normally and talk about politics without it devolving into just a series of ad hom attacks.
Time for one last question before we go on.
I'm interested in this discussion because I think about some of the ongoing Senate debates right now. And specifically, I think back to the Georgia debate between Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker, where Warnock and Walker both engaged in what some could call ad hominem attacks. But there's, I think, a difference when you're thinking about criticizing character issues, such as what Raphael Warnock was doing with, questioning Walker's relationship with the truth and things along those lines that have an impact on the job, versus the kinds of attacks that we see other politicians on either side of the aisle making. I wonder what you make of the relationship between these ad hominem attacks and the need for character-based questioning of people who are going to be leading the nation. And so how do we make that difference clear and more palatable to a political audience that needs to be aware of those kinds of character debates that happen?
That's a really interesting question, because when Joe Biden was running, most of his platform and all of his endorsements were just Joe Biden is a better man than Donald Trump is. That speaks to his character. So I think that when you have someone else talking about your character in an endorsement, or when you have someone questioning you about something that you did and how that speaks to you as a person, it is a little bit different from just saying you're stupid. Especially because in those situations, like the Georgia debate you were talking about, the person being questioned has a chance to answer. That is a very key difference between ad hom attacks and questioning someone's character. Ad hom attacks are normally just said to a crowd of people, and people believe it.
All right, thanks, Shreya.
Oh, nice. I've never been mic'd up before. This is kind of cool. I'm Parker Jeffrey, sophomore in mechanical engineering, like Dr. Boyd said, my bad. I took Dr. Boyd's CommTool 4 class in fall of 21 and really enjoyed it, and that inspired me to participate in the undergraduate research competition. So I'm delighted to be here to present to you guys what I researched. As a kid, I would sit in my living room listening to my dad rant about politics while watching the nightly news. I've come to think of this as the American childhood rite of passage. I started to wonder how any millionaire politician in DC could relate to my dad, as we were just a middle-class family in Chicago. He would sit and complain about some politician and say, "I can't believe anyone supports them," or rave about some other politician that stands for his values. When I learned about Burke's model of identification, however, I started to wonder if this is how politicians are able to reach their audiences. Today, I'm going to introduce you to the model and walk through some examples in campaign speeches and ads. The model of identification is a process of persuasion by aligning yourself with the audience in order to convince them on a topic. There are 4 steps in the model: division, appeal, consubstantiality, and action. For a person to be persuaded on an issue, there needs to be 2 sides to an issue. This creates division. The next step is an appeal, one of 2 appeals: ways and interests. Ways is more basic and focused on physical aspects such as hair, eye color, clothes, and anything tangible. Interest is more sophisticated and focuses on attitudes and beliefs and is anything non-tangible. The third step is consubstantiality. That took me about a week to be able to pronounce. Consubstantiality is when you reach common ground with your audience. This allows you to transition to the 4th step of action. This is when you ask your audience for their vote or approval or disapproval on a subject. Consubstantiality and action are sometimes hard to see in campaign videos, so I decided to focus mainly on the appeals and how the candidates use these. The first clip I'm using is from Obama at 2012 re-election campaign at Carnegie Mellon University. This is the beginning of his speech where he's casually talking to his audience before he dives into the political agenda.
A very important situation has arisen. The White Sox and the Pirates are in first place. So we may be in the World Series together. We love each other and we can root for each other until we get to the World Series.
So the president casually talks to his audience about baseball, but when do you think the last time he sat down and actually watched a game was? Obama establishes a connection between Chicago and Pittsburgh. But an interesting thing is that Obama was not actually born in Chicago, he was born in Hawaii, but realizes that for most Americans, Hawaii is a fabled vacation destination and not a hometown. So instead, he relates the big city of Chicago to the big city of Pittsburgh, and through a common topic of baseball. It helps that his audience is mostly left-leaning, so that it can help strengthen the connection that he already has with his audience. As well as campaign speeches, campaign ads use the model of identification to try to persuade their audience in a short amount of time. This next clip is from Greg Abbott's 2014 governor campaign while he was Texas Attorney General. I clipped out the middle part of the ad where he talks about his plans for infrastructure and focused mainly on his ways appeal.
A guy in a wheelchair can move faster than traffic on some roads in Texas. I'm Greg Abbott. Elect me, and I'll get Texas moving.
So Greg Abbott takes a saying, "I could roll faster than this traffic," literally. He makes a physical connection between his wheelchair and the cars on the road. By putting his wheelchair on the street next to the cars, he creates a physical connection that relates his wheelchair to the vehicles. Most Americans would not be able to relate to being in a wheelchair, but they would be able to relate to being stuck in traffic. So by making this connection, he can reach a broader range of his audience. He shows Texans that he too gets stuck in traffic and wants to do something about it. Politicians may seem like they are these untouchable figures that have nothing to do with us normal folk, but somehow they get us to believe that they stand for the opinions of the people in our communities. Through this research, I was able to draw a connection to my dad and understand why he would rant about politics so much and how some politicians might have been able to support him. The model of identification draws a strong connection between political candidates and their supporters. Clearly, from all of my dad's ranting, the model might not always work. Thank you.
Okay, who has the first question for Parker?
So when you hear your dad ranting, what aspect do you see most clearly in your 4 pieces?
That's a good question. I think mainly since he already kind of knows which candidates he likes and which he doesn't like, I'd probably say like the consubstantiality and action pieces, just because that influences the way that he's going to vote in the next election. So I think in that case, the appeal is not as appealing to him because he's already made up his mind.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Fantastic presentation. One of the questions that I had, obviously the two examples from Obama and Abbott you had are much more aspirational and positive in tone. What and how would you think potentially if a politician were engaging in identification using maybe more negative appeals, what would that look like in these different contexts?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I've never really thought of the negative aspect, but probably that would be them trying to like dissociate with another candidate. So with like the action step, they want the vote or their approval or disapproval on the topic. So trying to relate to an audience to say, don't vote for this candidate because I relate to you in this. So an example that Dr. Boyd gave in class was like a businessman with a construction hat. So he would go to the site and say, all right, I'm for the workers, I'm for the people, so don't vote for this other guy because, I support you and I stand with your beliefs more.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm not as familiar with the identification process, but do you think, does it work in sort of the same function at any level of office, or would candidates sort of employ it maybe differently in a governor versus like local office, for example?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I chose like two different offices to kind of show that it can be at different levels. I know this is, kind of higher levels, like president and governor is more influential than local politics, but I think local politics could actually be, the appeal could be more persuasive because there's more room for people to flip. A lot of times with like the presidential campaigns, especially like, if Obama talks about baseball, you might not say, all right, now I'm a Democrat. But if a local person, comes to your work site wearing the construction hat and has those appeals, it might be more convincing. So that's definitely an interesting thing to look at in further research.
Thanks, Parker.
All right, hi everyone. Bear with me, I'm recovering from a cold, so my voice is a little rough, but it was actually gone yesterday, it's back today, so glad it's here. As Dr. Boyd has mentioned, I'm a junior in neurobiology and physiology. I was a Spanish minor, and I was one of the winners of the C-SPAN competition last fall. So yeah, but before I go ahead and start, I want to ask a quick question. Raise your hand if you know who this is. Right, I think most, if not all of you guys know who this is. This is Simone Biles. She's an Olympic gymnast. She holds a record amount of world and gold medals, and she carries the weight of a lot. USA representing us, representing all that, to the Olympics, to the world. But
today, I don't want another young gymnast, Olympic athlete, or any individual to experience the horror that I and hundreds of others have endured before, during, and continuing to this day in the wake of the Larry Nassar abuse. To be clear,
Take your time.
To be clear, I blame Larry Nassar, and I also blame an entire system that enabled and perpetrated his abuse. USA Gymnastics.
Okay, so in this clip, Simone Biles testifies about the abuse of Olympic gymnasts during the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing about Larry Nassar's abuse investigation. she not only appeals to the Senate, but also appeals to the audience's emotion. This appeal to the emotion is called pathos. While her testimony is necessary because it's an actual crime that needs to be punished, the emotions that she induces, the emotions that she has, induces an empathetic and emotional response from the senators, from the audience, and from the viewing public. So if that clip didn't clarify exactly what I'm talking about today, I'm talking about emotional appeal, pathos, and how they've been used in congressional testimonies to influence the audience. So just to give some context, pathos is one of the 3 modes of persuasion that goes way back to Aristotle's time. Ethos is one of them. It's the persuasion through author's credibility. Logos is persuasion through logic. And pathos is today's topic, persuasion through emotion. And just to further show the effectiveness of emotional appeal, pathos, let's look at another example.
I've been engaged on this problem as an anesthesiologist involved in acute and chronic pain management, and as you heard from Senator Cardin, as head of a state health department dealing with an unprecedented opioid-fueled HIV outbreak. But my work on the opioid epidemic is also very, very personal. My younger brother Philip struggles with the addiction of disease. His struggle began with untreated depression, leading to self-medication and opioid misuse. And like many with co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders, my brother has cycled in and out of incarceration. He's currently serving a 10-year prison sentence for crimes committed to support his addiction. This epidemic is blind to color, geography, and class, as addiction can happen to anyone, even the brother of the United States Surgeon General.
So this clip features Dr. Jerome Adams, who was a former Surgeon General and is now the Presidential Fellow and Executive Director of Purdue's Health and Equity Initiatives, actually. So that's kind of cool to just mention. But in this clip, he advocates for a better system for those undergoing an opioid use disorder to the Congress. It makes sense because he's the former Surgeon General, he's a doctor, so his credibility should be enough. However, he actually twists this information and uses emotional appeal. Like Simone, Dr. Adams appeals emotionally by bringing up his brother's experiences, his brother's suffering, and all of that from his opioid use disorder. Similar to Simone, he induces an emotional response from the audience, but he appeals more by reminding the audience about their family and fear of losing a loved one and fear of having a loved one go through so much suffering. Now, I have another clip that I want you guys to compare to the first 2 clips that you guys.
Sure. Again, community-based care is critically important, and access to medications, and medications are the gold standard, and there's a strong evidence base that medications are important for people's recovery from opioid use disorder. Opioid use disorder is a chronic brain disease, and like diabetes and hypertension, there are medications available for people to use. And we know that these medications have an evidence base of showing that people adhere to their treatment. And we also know that they help to keep people from contracting other chronic diseases and other diseases such as HIV or hepatitis.
So that was a very factual and informational clip. In fact, they had pretty similar goals as Dr. Jerome Adams' clip. They just both want a better system for those going through the opioid epidemic, the opioid use disorder. But did it make you think of your family like Dr. Adams' testimony did? Did it make your heart wrench like Simone Biles' testimony did? Well, there's response to logic. There's logos. She's very credible, has a lot of good information. The lack of emotional appeal may be a weakness, may be the weakness to her clip, to that testimony. So now after these 3 clips, I hope that the importance and utility of one's emotional appeal is evident. While I presented this last year, actually, I was taking COM 217 class, and in the textbook presentation that mattered, a quote that stood out to me was that one of the primary reasons that they are so powerful is because stories can promote an empathetic and emotional response. Clearly, as shown in today's presentation, stories do in fact create an empathetic and emotional response, which strengthens the testimony and makes it stronger to the Congress, to the viewing public, and to the world. That's all for today. Thank you.
Okay, who has the first question for Abby this morning?
Hi, great presentation, and all of these presentations, I think, have been really good at showing how important personal connection is. I did want to ask, so like in your clip, he did, the second one, he did talk about how he had his personal struggle, but he said in addition to it just being a bigger problem, I was curious, how do they interact logos with emotional appeals? Do they say like a logical statement first, a straightforward fact, and then get into storytelling? What did you see when you were looking at these?
I think definitely, obviously, all the modes of persuasion are important and necessary, and obviously, one has to have credibility in order to even testify. Like Dr. Adams and Simone, they can't testify if they don't have the basis of the testimony. But I think that the emotional appeal, the pathos, strengthens it because I know this isn't Dr. Adams's part, but for Simone Biles' appeal, the investigation has been going on for so long, and it took a bunch of gymnasts' emotional appeal, pathos, testimony, for action, for things to change in general, not just with Larry Nassar's investigation, but just in general, if that makes sense. So I do think that logos is important. I didn't find any indication that logos is necessary before or after, but I think that it's important to include pathos in one's testimony in order to make people more convinced, if that makes sense.
Thanks. So I noticed at one point you used the word twisted when you were talking about Dr. Adams' testimony, that he used the story of his brother and then twisted it to make it an emotional appeal. So that word kind of has connotations that it's underhanded or undesirable or something like that. So what do you think is what makes, and I'm not sure that was what you were trying to say about his testimony, but what do you think is the difference in emotional appeals that are legitimate ways to connect with people and help them understand the importance of something, as opposed to emotional appeals that might be manipulative?
I think there are definitely people who would use emotional appeal to be manipulative. Like, for example, I feel like I as a child would just try to emotionally manipulate my parents by crying or being sad. And obviously that's the scale that's very different from these. Only as a child. Only as a child. Hey, not anymore. No promises. I'm just kidding. But there's definitely people who would probably use emotional appeal in a negative, manipulative way. If I use the word twisted and it gave a negative connotation, that's not what I meant. But I think my point in Dr. Adams was that he didn't have to include his brother. He didn't have to include his brother's experience. He didn't have to connect it to him. Because he himself is credible enough as a Surgeon General, as a doctor, as having a lot of experience with that. He himself is credible enough, and by connecting his brother's experience to his credibility, it strengthens his argument, if that makes sense, I think.
I noticed that you focused on committee hearings. Did you take any opportunities to look at, let's say, campaign rallies or speeches given by politicians who are running for office?
I actually didn't. When I took this class, I was taking COM 217, which is scientific research. So our focus was more on scientific stuff. Therefore, I'm focused on like opioid use disorder because that was a topic given to me. Well, it was a science-based class, so it wasn't very politics. My major is neurobiology. I'm pre-med, so I never really went out of my way watching campaigns and all of that. But I think I would probably find like a negative use of pathos during those times, like similar to the ad hom fallacies.
Well, I would like to thank all three of our students and Dr. Boyd for a fantastic session.